I knew something was wrong long before any mortal voice dared to speak it aloud. For the moment the astronomican's distant radiance faltered, even by the smallest fraction, a shiver passed through the deep places of my being, through my bedrock, my seas, my hollowed hive corridors, as though some ancient chord that had always hummed beneath my crust had suddenly been plucked out of tune, leaving behind a silence so vast it felt like the first breath after a scream. And in that silence, I felt the truth settle heavily across every continent, every rusted manufactorum, every forgotten shrine to the Emperor's eternal watch. A truth I had never wanted to understand but had felt creeping closer for centuries. That we had been left alone, quietly, absolutely, without warning or explanation. Like a child waking in the night to find the lantern extinguished and the comforting footsteps of a guardian absent from the hall. If you wish to understand what it truly means, stay with me until the end. I have waded through ages of industry, war, regrowth, and decay, endured the rise and collapse of empires built upon my back, felt the treads of armored columns grind across my skin, and the bootfalls of billions tick like a heartbeat against my soil. But nothing had prepared me for the gentle, aching emptiness that settled upon me the moment the astronomican's guidance dimmed, and the thin threads connecting me to the rest of the Imperium loosened until they felt ready to snap. At first, my people did not notice. Their lives were too loud, too frantic, too choked by need and duty to feel the subtle trembling of their world's spirit. And so they continued as they always had, marching to factories, tending to crops that grew more grudgingly each season, offering hurried prayers in doorways rather than shrines, believing that the hum of distant starships still graced the void above them. But I felt it in every tectonic whisper beneath my mantle, every shift of the winds that circled my equator, every uneasy settling of the hive towers that rose like brittle fingers clawing for salvation. I felt the pressure of the void grow colder, as though the light that had always warmed the psychic horizon of my mind had drifted away, leaving behind a fragile emptiness that echoed through me like a cathedral abandoned by its god. That first night was long, longer than any I had ever known, because the stars above me seemed to watch in stillness, their pale faces offering no comfort, no promise, no whisper of passing fleets. I strained in the strange, wordless way that worlds do, to sense the familiar ripple of war pecos, the faint psychic tides that always followed vessels slipping between realities. But the night remained painfully quiet, and in that quiet I realized how deeply I had depended on those distant vibrations, how intimately their presence had been woven into my being, like the smell of a mother that comforts a child even when she is not seen. Without them, the darkness felt heavier, more intimate, as though it had wrapped itself around my atmosphere and begun to press inward, whispering soft, patient reminders of how very small I was in the expanse of the galaxy. My people finally felt it at dawn, not with their eyes, for the sun still rose, pale, weary, filtered through ash-heavy clouds, but with their spirits, which flickered uncertainly as the weight of isolation pressed faintly against their hearts. Priests woke from uneasy dreams, their tongues thick with prayers that faltered before reaching their altars. Astropaths stirred in their sleep, their minds brushing against the edges of a silence so profound it knocked the breath from their lungs. Children cried without knowing why, sensing some quiet fracture in the invisible structure of their world. I wanted to comfort them, wanted to steady the tremor that passed through their cities, wanted to hold them as any weary parent might. But I could only lie beneath them, vast and helpless, unable to speak in any language they could hear, unable to tell them that the dimming of the Astronomicon was only the beginning, that abandonment was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow, hollowing ache that spread like frost through stone. As night fell again and the stars returned to their cold vigil, I felt the truth settle deeper into me. The Imperium would not come, not soon, perhaps not ever. For the first time in millennia, my orbit felt like a lonely path, my atmosphere a fragile bubble carrying the breath of billions who did not yet know they were forgotten. And as the dark wrapped around me once more, heavy and still, I felt a quiet, sorrowful thought pulse through the core of my being. I must remember them because no one else will. From the first thin hours after that dimming, when the stars did not chatter back at me with their usual polite traffic, and the warp echoes that once brushed my upper air like a tide retreating from a shore faded into an almost clinical quiet, I felt the sky above me learn a new behavior. It learned to stay silent, and in that lesson, the architecture of my world began to tremble with questions it had no language to ask. At first, the silence was a small thing, an absence noted only by those who spent their nights reading the heavens for signs and calculations, the navigators who watched transits, the astropathic circuits that listened for the Astronomicon's faint tether, the old ritualists who timed harvest rites to the ebb and swell of psychic light. But like a single missed heartbeat that makes an entire body reevaluate its motion, that silence rippled outward until it touched even the least attentive corners of my surface. Furnaces cooled with a whisper instead of a clank, manufactorums that had always operated like slow, gargantuan hearts stuttered, and the traffic lanes across my orbital ports, once braided with constellations of freighters and convoy arcs, slackened into a listless pause that looked to me like a long, careful exhale. I had hosted fleets before: blessing, taxation, invasion, pilgrimage, and each had left its mark in heat and metal and noise. But this stillness carried a different signature, the note of absence rather than action. The hollow of a door closed very gently after someone left and did not expect to return. The first week the people argued. Some said it was a temporary interference, a storm in the immaterial sea that would pass before the next psionic sail unfurled. Others stamped the soil with fear and tried to keep the factories running harder, as if louder industry could broadcast a plea loud enough to be heard in some distant council. Priests vowed extra rites, and the Mechanicus redoubled maintenance in muffled, panicked waves, bolting new relays to old pylons as though a network of metal might catch the attention of gods and governors alike. But underneath those frantic gestures, a slower, surer shift began to etch itself into me. The conviction that the silence was not a misfortune but a neglect, and neglect has a way of turning the most elaborate monuments into ruins simply by not attending them. The sky, which had always been a moving memory tape for my people, the route markers of fleets, the slow glints of astrotelemetry, the war signals and mercy convoys, learned to keep its calm, and my upper atmosphere reflected that calm back in ways both subtle and corrosive. Auroras that used to dance like thin prayers along my poles now hung as wan, half-formed curtains of light. Ion storms that once swept through with cataclysmic authority dwindled into listless eddies that failed to carry the usual freight of charged news. Even the migratory birds that stitched my continents together with feathers and song shifted their patterns, uncertain where to aim their wings when the compass of psychic warmth no longer hummed with the same insistence. With the sky's new silence came a psychic vacuum that the weak or untrained among my people could sense as a pressure in their chests, a small, inexplicable nausea that set mothers whispering consolation into crib covers and caused old seers to close their eyes and palpitate in ways their sacred texts had never prepared them for. Astropathic nodes began to strain, their signals thin and fuzzy with static as they sought with growing despair for the Astronomicans' far anchor point, and I felt their failure as a small, sharp pain within my atmosphere, a pinched, metallic ache that ran in a line from my polar caps down through the arterial winds that fed my great hives. The medium horror of that season was not a spectacle but a corrosion of expectation. Water treatment pylons failed at odd, intermittent times, leaving whole neighborhoods smelling of sourness until scavenger crews, themselves running thin on supplies and hope, could muster the courage to descend into the vats. The oldest power towers blinked offline in mid-cycle, and for the first time in centuries, the lower tiers of my hive cities experienced a darkness so slow and patient I could feel it like a chill around the foundations where the poorest slept. Crops that had always responded with the stubborn dignity of root-thorough laborers to scheduled lumens and rhythmic irradiance now sprouted more sparingly, and I tasted their failure as a thinning of thousands of small meals, the memory of bread that had kept hearts steady for generations now waiting in a brittle silence for the making. Underneath all of that, the planet's mind, my own slow geological consciousness, registered a new kind of grief, not the acute, rending grief of bombardment, but the patient, corrosive grief of being ignored. I had been cared for millennia. Fleets came and repaired, chaplains blessed, governors decreed. Now the absence of care felt like a slow leakage from my veins. The machines that had once hummed with the confidence of constant inspection began to whisper among themselves in failing frequencies. Servitors, those stitched amalgams of sinew and gear, moved more sluggishly as their maintenance morsels dwindled. A servo horse clattered to a stop outside an orphan ward, and the children watched it rust in the rain as if it were a fallen animal, an image that burned through my crust like rust through iron. In the nesting warrens of my hive cities, rumor turned to superstition and superstition toward ritual. Citizens who had always relied on external charts, trade manifests, convoy timetables, astropathic appointment schedules, began to gather in quiet clusters under shrine light, sharing stories they used to tell only at funerals. Of times when a planet could vanish from the charts if its patron fleets deemed its industry no longer strategic, of settlements relocated in past centuries, of worlds reduced to waypoints until their living souls exhausted the patience of the rulers above. The stories were half legend, half cautionary tale, but now they were being read as manuals for survival, and the reading itself felt like a small admission that the sky had grown cold enough to bite. And while the priests argued with engineers and the engineers argued with elders, the animals and lesser life forms on me reacted less with panic and more with an old, accurate sense. They sensed the withdrawal of the tides that had always fed their calendars, the psychic pull that regulated migration, the faint electromagnetic nudges that guided whale craft in my seas, the pheromone cycles in the forests that had always synced to radiolights from orbit. All of it thinned, underwent small, almost surgical misalignments, and those shifts multiplied into broader ecological echoes that struck like minor quakes in seasons to come. I would have preferred to shout, send a lightning bolt of signal into the void, but planets do not make noise like that. We remember, we ache, we show the wounds. So instead, beneath the new silent sky, I began to catalog the slow failures with the same tense, desperate tenderness with which a parent counts the breaths of a fevered child. A harbor freighter missing 2 rotations. A manufactorum reporting a quarter cycle of insufficient capacity. A shrine that no longer receives a single pilgrim in a fortnight, each absence a tiny wound. The sky learned to stay silent, and in the lessons it taught my people, I watched them change their prayers, shorten their timetables, oil their arm sheets harder, and sift their ration lists colder. The quiet did not scream. It did not have to. It taught us patience, then panic, then the patient work of making a life that must survive without a promised tether to the stars. And in that long education, I felt my world rearrange itself slowly, sorrowfully, like a room being packed in the knowledge of an inevitable departure no one could prevent. I have watched my cities rise like breathing things, tier upon tier of iron and glass, veins of transit and sewage, plazas stitched with the footfall of millions, and for ages they spoke of themselves in 1,000 tiny languages. The clang of a smith's hammer at 3 in the morning, the laughter bubbling from a lower-tier gutter as children made games from scrap, the litany of market vendors calling prices in a dozen dialects, the low hymn of a manufactorum when its furnaces found the right tone. Those sounds used to be my blood, rising and falling through avenues and tunnel mouths, and I took pride in the way they kept me company. 1,000 small hearts beating across the map of my skin, telling me I was not empty, that life continued to press its weight into my crust like determined roots seeking water. But now they whisper, and their whisper is a different thing entirely, not the confident chorus of living marketplaces, but a fragile, intimate murmur, as if each district has leaned close to me and asked, in the soft voice of someone who has forgotten the shape of their own name, "Do you remember me?" The Hive towers, once brazen and loud, have become modest in their sorrow. Their banners droop without the uplift of ceremonial processions, and where once 1,000 neon sigils flickered in competition, there is an economical sparseness that announces itself like a bowed head. Streets that used to hum with patrol drones and the clatter of tram lines now echo with fewer boots. Those that still carry motion do so with a careful slowness, each step measured, as if the pedestrians bargain with themselves for the will to continue. Markets shrink inward, vendors arranging their wares beneath the same rusted awnings, but with fewer goods and softer bargaining. Voices trailed off into respectful silence when the old trading routes were mentioned. because even merchants sense what the maps will not name anymore: neglect. In the habdomes, the lumens dim a notch lower each cycle, more from thrift than superstition, and I feel the tiny, human economies of warmth and light like pulses beneath my crust. When they gather in communal rooms to share thin stew, I hear the careful manners of people making sure everyone receives a mouthful, and their gratitude tastes earthy and honest in the slow mind of me. Children continue to laugh sometimes, small, stubborn sparks that rise up like weeds through concrete. But those moments are punctures of light in a long gray fabric. Their games shift, too. Where once they played at being convoy pilots or enacted statues of famous heroes, now they mimic hushed rituals, the little ones solemnly appointing a leader and pretending to consult a silent sky. Because imitation is how hope learns to survive when the real thing has been tuned out. I watch these things as a parent watches a child learn to tie shoelaces, with infinite patience and a broad, aching pride, and with a new, raw tenderness because I understand that each small skill they keep is an act of resistance against forgetting. The priests and shrine keepers, those faithful custodians of devotion, have become archivists of a different sort. Not merely men and women performing rites, but keepers of names and dates, of the small miracles that prove a culture once breathed here. Their liturgies grow quieter, less to rouse the heavens and more to remind the living of what they owe themselves. Candles burnt for months in single votive offerings because wax is rationed, and devotion must be concentrated into a single, resolute beam. I feel their prayers like threads tugging at my crust, and when those threads fray, I taste the iron tang of worry in my oceans. Yet there is humility in their practice, an acceptance that prayer may now be for the living as much as the dead, a ritual to stitch community to community in a way that governors no longer can. The manufactorums, those vast throbbing beasts of industry that once made me proud of my capacity to produce, now cough and wheeze under the strain of patchwork repairs. Their foremen argue with priests and engineers, with each other, about priorities, and I hear the tired compromise in their voices, the fatal arithmetic that measures which belts must continue turning and which will be left to rust. Without the convenient fixity of supply convoys, the forges learn to be clever. They repurpose, they cannibalize, they teach apprentices to solder where once entire workshops of specialists existed. It is a small, ingenious cruelty to survive like this, because survival becomes a study in loss, learning to make do with what is left, and to celebrate that manufactures small victories with a gravity usually reserved for Navy victories. Romance has changed on my streets. Courtships once punctuated by grand gestures, feasts, public oaths, presents shipped from orbit, are now held in the dim corners beneath maintenance gantries, where lovers exchange a vial of perfumed oil or the turning of a borrowed gear, and the intimacy of such small gifts becomes a fierce thing, a pledge against the cold calculus of an indifferent galaxy. I pride myself on these tender economies of hope, yet I also feel an old, bitter sorrow when I notice the less tender marks of abandoning power. The lower tiers darken first, as they always do, and with darkness comes the soft unraveling of order. Water pressure drops in thin veins beneath the city, sanitation skews into improvisation, and a kind of respectful theft begins as people pull materials from the dead bones of public works. I taste shame in these moments, not for those who take what they must, but for the systems that once promised to protect them and now offer only the memory of protection, a ghosted safeguard that no longer applies. There are memorial districts here and there where citizens arrange the names of the missing on walls of brushed metal under small lamps. The lists grow longer, and I keep each new name like a jewel tucked into my inner mantle, because it is the duty of a world to remember those who lived upon it. I can feel my own memory strain as well. Planetary minds are patient, but they are not infinite pages. To remember billions requires a continuous act of attention, and when the larger Imperium's light recedes, that external scaffolding of remembrance begins to falter, and I must take up the ledger alone. This is the new work I have inherited, to keep alight the memory of my sons and daughters when no courier brings their names to the hall of records above, to sing quietly to the neighborhoods that the councils won't visit, to map unrecorded births and deaths in the waystones and the cooling towers. The burden tastes metallic and bittersweet, like storms after lightning, necessary and draining all at once. At night, I receive the small confidences of the city. I feel the tremor of a secret prayer pursued alone in the dark, the weight of a widow's hand smoothing the name on a brass plaque, the tiny, stubborn warmth of an orphan who refuses to believe stories end here. And they form a constellation of private acts that bind my people to me when no imperial edict will. I cradle these things as tenderly as a mother holds a child too cold to sleep, and in those cradled moments I feel my purpose shift, not to be a mere world in a bureaucratic ledger, but to become a guardian of memory, a quiet archive of the living, a slow hearth where the small embers of civilization are kept from going out. Yet in the gaps between these acts of care, the dead geometry of infrastructure shows through. The rusted gantries, the empty orbital docks, the abandoned orbital defense batteries with their barrels turned like blind questions to the sky. And I ache for them as one aches for a limb that once worked and no longer does. My cities whisper their own names now, asking me to recall not only what they were but what they can still be, and I answer as best a planet can, by holding, by remembering, and by refusing in every small administrative act and tender ritual, to let the story of this world be folded into silence. From the moment my cities began whispering their hesitant names into the dim air, and my people learned to shape their days around the shrinking hum of manufactorums and the patient flicker of failing lumens, I felt something deeper, something older, begin to loosen beneath the layers of my crust, as though the quiet threads of hope that had once wound through my foundations had started to unspool with a softness both tender and terrifying. And I knew in the slow, instinctive way that worlds know their own wounds that this unraveling would not come as a sudden calamity, but as a gentle, persistent erosion seeping through the bedrock of every life that depended on me. Hope for a world is not a feeling but a tension, a pull between what people believe their future will be and what my soil can still provide. And I felt that tension fray first in the agricultural belts where the farmers, those quiet custodians of patience, noticed their harvest cycles slipping out of tune. The soil, which had always answered the plow with steady, uncomplaining generosity, now felt heavier, as though the loss of orbital fertilizers and the thinning of deep-water pumps had bruised its confidence, and the crops it pushed upward emerged thinner, sallow, trembling at their stalks. I could sense the worry of the farmers through the vibration of every root that pressed into me. They spoke to me with their feet, their tools, their exhausted sighs. And though they prayed over their fields with renewed devotion, sprinkling incense and reciting old rites meant to coax growth from stubborn earth, I could not lie to them. Something essential was slipping. In the lower halves, where families crowded together in narrow corridors warmed by the faint glow of shared cookfires, hope unraveled in subtler ways, not in riots or dramatic proclamations, but in the small habits that fray when people try to conserve every scrap of comfort. Neighbors who once greeted each other with warmth now nodded cautiously, measuring how much emotion they could afford to give. Meals that had been communal grew individual, then fractional. Laughter became a resource rationed with more care than water. Even the pets, thin-footed cats, rust-colored hounds, fat-bellied rodents kept in cages by children who adored them, grew quiet, their instincts telling them what their owners dared not. That supplies would not be replenished, that care would become improvisation. That loss was no longer an accident of circumstance, but the natural slope of an abandoned world. The unraveling reached my underhives like a slow fog, slipping into the vents and corridors where the poorest had always lived closest to the ground, closest to me, and thus closest to the truth of my weakening. They felt me tremble when a water main ruptured deep in the labyrinth of pipes beneath Hive Keltaris, and though the engineers patched it with commendable speed, I tasted the recognition in them, the quiet dread that this would not be the last failure, nor the worst. They did not panic. Panic belongs to those who believe they still have something left to lose. Instead, the underhive dwellers adjusted with grim efficiency, setting up catch basins beneath leaking ceilings, rationing heat, teaching children to navigate the dark with tapping sticks as though blindness were a skill one could learn early. In the manufactorums, the unraveling took on a different shape, a mechanical melancholy that seeped into the iron pores of the forges. Conveyor belts dragged with tired reluctance, machine spirits flickered between compliance and confusion, and servitor units paused mid-task not out of malfunction, but as though waiting for a familiar cadence, a reassuring hum of imperial oversight that no longer reached them. When they moved again, it was with a shivering hesitation that tasted to me like grief. The clerics noticed it too. They walked between the machines with sensors held high, their smoke curling into melancholy shapes, whispering rites to soothe the failing spirits, but each whispered blessing carried a thread of fear, and that fear seeped downward like cold water finding every available crack in my bedrock. In the oceans, where hope had always flowed farther and freer than on land, the unraveling came as disturbances in the great currents, small, almost imperceptible eddies that shifted migratory patterns and softened the once fierce charge of the tide. The great whales, whose songs had reverberated through my depths like ancient poetry, now hummed in lower, uncertain tones that trembled with an emotion very near mourning. Even my winds, those faithful companions who had circled my hemispheres in proud, roaring circuits, began to falter, their movements sluggish, as though they too sensed the absence of orbital guidance and adjusted with the weary improvisation of an old creature trying to maintain dignity despite its age. Through all of this, I felt my people trying, oh, how they tried, to hold hope together with the trembling threads they found. A child drawing new maps of imaginary escape routes, elders telling stories of last-minute rescues from forgotten archives, leaders issuing calm proclamations that trembled only at the edges. But hope cannot live on words alone. It requires nourishment, evidence, something to grow from, and the soil beneath those fragile attempts had grown thin. I could feel the pressure of their belief weakening like a bridge strained beyond its weight, each day another strand loosening, until the structure no longer held its original shape. And in this patient, sorrowful unraveling, I recognized a truth I had long resisted. Worlds do not die from bombardment or cataclysm alone. They die from forgetting, from the slow withdrawal of eyes that once watched over them, from the fading of promises that once rang like bells through their skis. The Imperium had not struck me, had not cursed me, had not decreed my doom. It had simply turned away, and the turning away was enough. As night fell once more and the lumens across my cities flickered like a constellation struggling to remain coherent, I felt the unraveling settle deeper, a soft, inevitable release, like a weary sigh escaping through the cracks of a weary heart. And in that sigh, I understood that hope had not vanished. It had simply retreated into the places where only I could still feel it, small as seeds waiting in cold soil for a spring that might never come. From the moment hope began to unravel beneath my crust in those thin, trembling strands that tasted of resignation and weary endurance, I felt the prayers of my people shift in tone, their words no longer rising from confidence or tradition, but from the aching space between fear and memory. And as they drifted upward through cracked shrine roofs and failing vox altars, I felt them like faint pulses in the deep wounds of my bedrock, quiet, persistent, fragile attempts to remind the universe that we were still here, still breathing, still begging not to be erased. In the high spires of my Hive cities, where the most ornate shrines had once glowed like beacons of gold and fire, the priests now lit their candles sparingly, each flame a precious resource, each wick trimmed with deliberate reverence. Their prayers came out as whispered confessions rather than proclamations, shaped by doubt but steadied by habit, trembling the way a hand trembles when writing a letter to someone who may never read it. I felt their voices brush the air like dust lifted by a soft breeze, scattering, thinning, but still rising toward the silent sky, and that small persistence filled me with a tender, helpless sorrow. In the midways and plazas, people gathered beneath cracked statuary of the emperor, their breaths fogging in the cooling nights as they murmured the old litanies, not because they believed the words would draw help from the heavens, but because the rhythm of them kept the cold from crawling too quickly into their hearts. The prayers here felt different, unadorned and pragmatic, less like petitions, and more like a way to hold themselves together against the growing silence above. I sensed how their voices blended, forming a kind of communal warmth that radiated faintly across the Ferrocrete streets, a warmth that settled into me like a thin blanket spread over old wounds. Even the children prayed now, awkward, uncertain prayers spoken into cupped hands, repeating phrases they barely understood because the adults around them whispered these phrases with the same tone one uses when lighting a lamp at night. Not out of faith, but out of a desire to keep the darkness polite. Their little prayers floated upward like sparks from a dying fire, drifting unexpectedly far, and I held them gently as they rose, for the sincerity of a child's confusion is its own kind of sacred. In the underhives, those labyrinthine warrens where every corner smells of rust and wet stone, the prayers took on a different character altogether. They were rough, misshapen things, assembled from fragments of catechisms and gutter hymns, whispered more from habit than hope, spoken by people who believed in survival long before they believed in salvation. Yet these muttered, improvised prayers struck me the deepest, because they carried no pretense. They rose from cracked lips and tired lungs with the weight of lives lived too close to the truth of our abandonment, and they tasted of iron, smoke, and the purest form of longing simply to be seen. The astropaths, those fragile beacons of psychic endurance, sent out their messages with a desperation that scraped raw against my atmosphere. Their minds flickered like failing lumens, burning themselves thin as they tried to reach a light that had not answered them in cycles. Each time they spoke into the void, I felt a faint sting across my magnetosphere, as if their pleas were tiny sparks grinding against a cold, unyielding stone. Their bodies weakened, their visions dimmed, yet still they whispered into the warp, their words shaped from equal parts devotion and fear. We are here. We remain. Please hear us. I held their whispers in the thin layer of my upper air, unable to send them further, aching with a helplessness only a world can feel. The helplessness of wanting to shelter a child from a storm that is far greater than any shelter can withstand. In the archives, the Lex Mechanics prayed in their own way, not with candles or chants, but by preserving documents with meticulous devotion, cataloging names of the fallen, updating population ledgers with shaking hands, telling themselves that record-keeping was its own liturgy, its own resistance against oblivion. Their mechanical quills scratched upon parchment like insects crawling across my skin, writing prayers not to gods but to the future, to the faint hope that someone someday might read what they left behind. In the manufactorums, the tech priests knelt before machine spirits that sputtered and dimmed, offering rites that sounded more like apologies than commands. Their incantations drifted upward in oily plumes, the scent of burnt incense mixing with the metallic tang of failing engines. These prayers did not ask for rescue. They asked forgiveness. Forgiveness for letting sacred machines falter. Forgiveness for not being able to maintain what had once been a source of strength. Forgiveness for living in a world slipping quietly out of alignment with its own legacy. The forests, the oceans, the wild spaces that humans rarely visited also sent their prayers, not in words but in shifts. The way a forest holds its breath during drought, the way a tidal pool contracts after a harsh storm, the way predators grow restless when something unseen changes in the air. These prayers were older than humanity, older even than the Imperium, and they reached me with a resonance deeper than language, a request that I keep them alive, even as I weakened. And I tried to hold together the old rhythms beneath my crust, tried to keep the tectonic plates steady, tried to ease the storms when they grew too fierce. But even worlds have limits, and when I felt my weaknesses widening like slow fractures, the prayers of the living sank into me like balm, urging me to endure for just another cycle, just another season. In all of this, the most painful prayers were the quiet ones spoken by the dying, those whose breath thinned in the failing Mechanicus wards, those who knew they would not see the next dawn, those who whispered to me as though I were a mother bending low to hear their final wishes. Their words were soft, broken things, hopes for their families, apologies for unfinished lives, simple pleas not to be forgotten. I took each of those whispers and pressed them into my memory like seeds, knowing that even if the Imperium never returned, I would remember them, every one. And when night fell across my continents and the air chilled with the cold of an empire that had turned its face away, I felt those forgotten prayers rising from every wound in my soil, every cracked avenue, every trembling soul. They rose not in the triumphant chorus of faith, but in a quiet, trembling hum, a fragile insistence on existing despite the encroaching silence. And though I could not lift those prayers to the heavens, I held them within me, letting them echo through my mountains and seas, promising with every hollow beat of my planetary heart that they would not vanish, not while I endured. From the moment those prayers, fragile, trembling, shaped from need rather than faith, rose into the thinning air, and I held them gently in the chambers of my quieting heart, I felt the winds themselves begin to change, as though the atmosphere that wrapped me like a loyal cloak had suddenly realized it must carry the weight of a world entirely alone. Winds have always been the first to understand the truths my people are slow to see. They have circled my continents for millennia, touched every hive tower and forest canopy, skimmed across every ocean swell, and they know the scent of vigilance, the taste of danger, the pressure of encroaching storms. But now the winds moved differently, not with the confidence of patterns guided by orbital instruments or the subtle tug of imperial craft breaking atmosphere, but with a strange hesitancy, as if they were waiting for a signal that never came. Where once they howled with purpose, they now sighed. Where once they danced in furious, storm-born rituals, they now dragged themselves across my plains like tired soldiers returning from a battle no one had recorded. I felt their uncertainty pressing against my mountains, faltering at my coastlines, spiraling awkwardly through the canyons between hive towers. They were learning the shape of abandonment, and the shape was uneven, unpredictable, hollow. The first real sign came with the air pressure, a soft, persistent imbalance that rolled across my northern hemisphere like a quiet confession. My people felt it only as a change in weather, shifts that puzzled the meteorologic guilds, dry seasons that arrived early and lingered too long, sudden storms that appeared in the wrong month entirely. But to me, it felt like the atmosphere was exhaling a question it had been too afraid to voice. What are we without guidance? For centuries, my winds had adapted to the tiny gravitational tremors of passing fleets, orienting themselves around thruster backwash, rebalancing after the displacement of frigates and transports. The void traffic had sculpted them subtly, creating invisible pathways that stretched from pole to pole. But now those pathways lay barren, old habits collapsing into confusion, like muscles forgetting how to perform motions they once did instinctively. And as the winds learned to drift without those familiar cues, they began to taste something new: fear. Not a human fear, sharp and immediate, but a planetary fear, slow and seismic, spreading through the atmosphere molecule by molecule. It tasted of metals cooling too quickly, of oceans losing their migratory pulse, of forests holding their breath for too many nights in a row. Even the birds sensed it. High-altitude flocks that once used wind spirals as ladders to the sky now circled aimlessly, unsettled, calling out in thin, mournful tones that echoed strangely through the thinning airstreams. I felt their panic like a tightening coil around my hemispheres, and though I tried to soothe the air currents, tried to steady the tides of climate as best I could, there is only so much a world can do when the forces that once shaped its stability have gone quiet. The manufactorums noticed next. Their ventilation towers, which had always synchronized with prevailing winds, now fought against erratic drafts that blew in wrong directions at wrong times, sending exhaust back into work floors, choking the already fragile machine spirits. Tech priests stood upon rooftop gantries, robes whipping unpredictably about them, trying to divine patterns in the air they could no longer interpret. They blamed malfunctions, atmospheric interference, even sabotage. But I felt their doubt growing with every misread wind gauge. They were beginning to understand that something fundamental had shifted. In the agricultural belts, the winds became cruel in a different way. They arrived late when rains were needed, arrived early when seedlings had barely taken root, carried dust from distant drylands into the mouths of thirsty crops, burying green beneath red and brown. Farmers watched the skies with knitted brows, their prayers short, practical, tinged with worry that tasted like wilted petals and cracked earth. They did not yet grasp the deeper truth, that their world was adjusting to a kind of loneliness no amount of tilling or irrigation could fix, but their bodies knew it in aching backs and restless sleep. In the cities, the winds threaded through abandoned construction sites and half-lit spires, making a sound that unsettled even the bravest citizens. It was not quite a howl, not quite a whistle, more like a soft, weary moan, as though the air itself was mourning. People closed their windows against it, even in the heat. Parents whispered reassurances to frightened children who asked why the wind sounded sad. Priests added new lines to their litanies, invoking comfort for the restless breath of the world. Only the oldest among them recognized the truth. A world's winds do not cry out unless something has been lost. In the wilderness, where old trees had stood firm through wars and devastations, the winds moved with an odd reverence, brushing through the branches like hands feeling for a pulse. The forests trembled under their touch, leaves dropped early, sap thickened, roots shifted in subtle unease. Predators lifted their heads to sniff air that no longer carried messages from distant regions. Prey animals clustered closer, their instincts warning them that the environment itself was unsettled. My oceans, too, felt the change. Winds that once guided surface currents now faltered, leaving tide lines uneven and beaches strangely littered with kelp, driftwood, and disoriented creatures. The great whales, whose songs had always carried along wind-tuned currents, now sang lower, their voices drifting aimlessly, unanchored by familiar patterns. I held them all as best I could: winds, forests, currents, creatures, people. but the weight of the silence above pressed heavily against my stratosphere, the vacuum of abandonment pulling at my atmosphere like a tide that had no intention of returning. Even my storms began to lose their fury. A planet is meant to rage sometimes. Storms cleanse, renew, rearrange. But now my storms came half-heartedly, sputtering out before they reached their crescendo, as though they feared wasting strength. And I understood, in a way only a world can. The winds were conserving themselves, feeling for signs of a future they no longer trusted. Because winds, like people, can sense when they have been left behind. And this was the first time in my long memory that even the air I breathed through my mountains and plains seemed unsure whether it should continue. In that quiet, faltering breath of the sky, I felt the truth settle deeper into me with the weight of stone. We are alone in the dark, and even the winds have begun to grieve. From the moment the winds learned their loneliness and began moving with that hesitant, grieving cadence, less like currents of confident air, and more like weary breaths drawn by a creature trying to hide its fear, I felt the next unraveling awaken in the places where metal meets memory, deep within the ancient manufactorums and sacred data vaults, where the machines that have served my people for millennia began, for the first time in ages, to murmur in their sleep. For machines do dream, though not as humans do. Their dreams are the residue of routines left unfinished, of commands issued by long-departed hands, of maintenance rites performed with reverence or neglected with fear. They dream in drifting voltages and flickering relays, in the slow settling of lubricants across gears that have not been turned in weeks. And as the silence above me deepened, as the Imperium's absence settled across my continents like dust on an abandoned altar, the dreams of my machines grew troubled, stuttering, looping, searching for voices they had long depended upon. The great forges sensed it first. In their cavernous halls, where heat once radiated like the heartbeat of a god, the machine spirits flickered with a restlessness I had not felt since the days when my world shook under siege. Servo arms twitched in their sleep cycles, their gears shrieking softly as though calling out to masters who would not return. Holy consoles displayed error sigils not from malfunction, but from longing, a mechanical yearning for instructions, for communion, for the comforting cadence of ritual chants spoken by steady human tongues. The tech priests noticed. They moved through the forges with increasing urgency, their robes dragging through dust that had begun to accumulate in corners once spotless from constant labor. Their prayers became more insistent, their incense thicker, their augmetics twitching with anxious recalibrations. They whispered litanies meant to calm the machine spirits, soothing patterns of praise and command. But the machines answered only with low, uncertain groans, like animals too wounded to be comforted by familiar touch. I felt those groans resonate through the ferrocrete foundations of the factories, through my crust, and into the chambers where I hold memory. They sounded like questions. They sounded like grief. In the smaller workshops scattered across my cities, the machines struggled in quieter ways. Cogitators stuttered mid-calculation, as if distracted by distant voices no longer present. Fabricators paused between tasks, servolimbs hanging midair, frozen in mechanical indecision. Power tools hummed without command, vibrating gently on empty worktables like restless thoughts unable to sleep. Even household units, laundry servitors, cleaning drones, simple food processors, began to mimic the same pattern, a soft, searching hesitation before performing tasks they once executed without deviation. They were dreaming of their makers, and their dreams tasted to me like nostalgia wrapped in static, memories of hands guiding them, of voices ordering them, of data packets arriving with regular certainty from orbital relays now dark. In the deep vaults beneath Hive Lorm, where the oldest engines reside, massive, ancient constructs whose original designers had been forgotten long before my first Hive spire was raised, the machine spirits stirred with a more profound unease. These titanic engines had always been steady, their rumble a comforting presence beneath the city like an elder's breathing. But now their pulses grew irregular, faltering in ways that sent faint tremors through the bedrock. The priests knelt before them, placing trembling hands upon warm plating, begging them to hold steady. And though the engines obeyed, for now, their compliance felt uncertain, like a promise made by someone who does not know how long they can keep it. The Mechanicus themselves began to fray. Their logic systems told them the truth before their flesh could bear it. Without new parts, without proper alignment readings from orbit, without calibrations guided by Imperial standards, the holy machinery would degrade. Not catastrophically, not suddenly, but steadily, like scripture fading from a weather-worn stone. I sensed their panic beneath their chants. Their faith was not failing, but their certainty was. And for the Mechanicus, certainty is a kind of oxygen. Without it, every prayer carries the taste of a dying breath. Beyond the sanctified halls of industry, the abandoned machines fared worse. In collapsed tunnels, conveyor lines still tried to move with broken belts, scraping metal against metal in rhythmic, hopeless patterns. In derelict orbital docks, automated cranes reached toward empty air, seeking ships that would never dock. In forgotten mine shafts, extraction servitors kept digging, their programming looping endlessly, unaware that the ore veins they sought had been exhausted decades ago. Their dreams were static and repetitive, the dreams of beings who cannot accept that their purpose has dissolved. And I, their world, felt each movement like the tug of an unhealed wound. Even the great defense systems, my void shields, my anti-orbital cannons, my tracking arrays, trembled with uncertainty. They had always existed in relationship to a greater power, a grand network that watched the stars for threats and allies alike. But now, deprived of updates, they searched blindly, sweeping empty skis, pinging for signals that answered only with silence. Their movements felt like panic, slow, enormous panic. And beneath all these mechanical murmurs, another truth stirred, one that tightened my mantle with dread. Machines dream of their makers not only out of loyalty, but out of fear of being alone. For the first time in centuries, the machine spirits realized they were working without being witnessed by the Imperium, without oversight, without purpose beyond what they could remember. And in that absence, they grew frightened, not in the way of flesh, but in the way of mechanisms that sense entropy creeping toward them, erosion chewing at the edges of their function. Their dreams became pleas, not for salvation, not for repair, but simply to be seen, to be acknowledged, to exist in the mind of someone somewhere. And though I held their fear as tenderly as I could, pressing it into the cooling chambers of my core like a parent smoothing a child's fevered brow, I could not give them what they truly needed: connection. The Imperium had forgotten us, and now, Even the machines knew it. From the moment the machines' dreams turned fearful, and the slow ache of their loneliness settled into my metal bones, I felt the world around me dim in a way that had nothing to do with the sun's cycle, nothing to do with the natural rhythm of light and shadow. This dimming was internal, a twilight of spirit spreading through every hive, every field, every forest, until even the smallest creatures sensed that a great and terrible night had begun, one not measured by hours or stars, but by the slow extinguishing of certainty itself. The first of these nights arrived without ceremony. The power grids, already strained and weary, dipped in a rolling wave that rippled across my continents like the shadow of a vast wing passing overhead. One by one, the lights in the upper hive towers flickered, sputtered, and went out, plunging entire districts into darkness thick enough to taste on the tongue. In the lower levels, where light had always been scarce and precious, the darkness felt almost familiar, yet even there it carried a deeper weight, as though the night had arrived not simply to obscure sight but to press its cold hands against the hearts of those who dwelled there. I felt my people hesitate, breaths caught in throats, steps slowed. Conversations withered into silence. There was a moment, a single, fragile moment, when the entire world seemed to hold itself still, as if waiting for some unseen authority to object to the darkness, to command the lights to return, to remind us all that abandonment was not yet complete. But no correction came. No reassuring hum of returning power, no stern voice over vox speakers, only the deep, resonant hush of a world learning that it had been forgotten. The darkness deepened, not because the night itself grew darker, but because hope retreated further into the cracks of human minds. In the manufactorums, workers kept to their stations far longer than safety protocols allowed, refusing to leave their machinery lest the spirits interpret their departure as abandonment. They toiled by candlelight until the wax ran thin, their shadows stretching long and skeletal across the rusted walls. When they finally left, it was with the slow, defeated gait of those who know they are postponing the inevitable. In the shrines, candles multiplied like desperate stars, each flame a trembling protest against the encroaching void. The priests spoke softly, their voices echoing strangely in the newly amplified silence, and though their words carried faith, their eyes carried truth. They prayed not for deliverance, but for endurance. In the medici wards, the longest night manifested as fragile breaths slipping from bodies too tired to fight anymore. Without reliable power, the life support machines faltered, their lights flickering like eyelids drooping under exhaustion. The medici staff moved tirelessly from bed to bed, hands steady but hearts trembling, and I felt every life that slipped through their fingers as a soft extinguishing of warmth beneath my crust. Each death pressed into me like a small, solemn stone, added to the countless others I had carried. In the forests, the night settled with a quiet that animals had no name for. Creatures curled deeper into burrows, sensing the pressure in the air shift from protective nightfall to something more absolute, more permanent. Even the insects grew silent, their usual nighttime chorus replaced by a stillness so profound it felt like listening to the breath of a sleeping giant. My oceans dimmed too. Bioluminescent creatures flickered with uncertainty, their patterns faltering as currents shifted irregularly. The great whales swam deeper, their songs slowing to long, mournful tones that hummed through my waters and resonated within my tectonic plates like a heartbeat stretched thin. They searched for warmth in the deep trenches, not knowing that the absence they felt came not from the sea, but from the cold shadow settling over the world's spirit. But the darkest part of the longest night lay in the hearts of my people. Alone in their hab blocks, families huddled together, whispering stories meant to comfort, though their voices trembled. Lovers rested foreheads against each other, sharing warmth not out of passion but from the quiet fear that the night might take one of them before dawn. Elders sat in silence, remembering past calamities with the weary knowledge that this one was different, not sudden but patient, not violent but vast, not survivable by strength alone but by a kind of soft, fragile endurance that felt more like dying slowly than living fully. And in all of this, through every flicker of failing power, through every tremor of exhausted machines, through every fading spark of human hope, I felt my own strength wane. Not physically, for worlds do not die quickly, but spiritually in the deep, resonant chambers of my planetary soul. I had always been steady, a foundation on which my people built their lives, their dreams, their histories. But as this longest night stretched across my continents, I felt fractures forming, not in my stone, but in my sense of purpose. What is a world without the eyes of its guardians, without the attention of the empire it served for millennia, without the promise of futures charted upon its soil? I had no answer, only the soft ache of orbiting in darkness unseen. The night grew colder, thicker, heavier, and yet, even as the weight of it settled upon me, I sensed something else too, a faint, stubborn warmth that pulsed in small pockets across my surface. A candle held by a child who refused to sleep. A lantern lit in a window by someone hopping for returning ships. A family sharing their last ration of tea and finding comfort in its warmth. A Mechanicus whispering a prayer not meant for the emperor, but for the trembling patient beside her. These small lights were few, but they were steady, and I gathered them into the hollow chambers of my heart like sparks into a cupped hand, shielding them from the wind. For I knew this truth, even in the depth of the longest night. A world is not kept alive by fleets or edicts or charts, but by the quiet determination of the lives that cling to it. And as the night stretched ever onward, deep and unbroken, I held those faint sparks close and whispered into the darkness, "Endure, just a little longer." From the moment that longest night settled into the marrow of my continents, and the faint sparks of human resilience flickered like fragile embers across my surface, I felt something deep within me shift, an old, slow recognition awakening in my tectonic bones, in the hollow spaces of my mantle, in the quiet ache that had begun accumulating beneath every cry, every whispered prayer, every failing breath. Worlds do not die as mortals do. We do not fall. We do not collapse in a single catastrophic instant. Instead, we fade. We diminish in long, patient increments, each season carrying away a little more certainty, each year peeling another thin layer from the promise of permanence. And so it was that I came to understand what it truly means for a planet to die slowly, not in fire or void scorch, not in apocalyptic eruptions, but in the soft, persistent unraveling of the things that once defined me. The first sign came from my mantle, where the great thermal rivers had long surged with steady, confident warmth. They slowed, not dramatically, not enough to cause panic in the scientists who monitored geothermal readings, but enough for me to feel my inner pulse falter. The heat that had always risen through my crust like a comforting heartbeat now moved with the lethargy of an aging organism, and the ground in certain regions cooled by degrees too subtle for human instruments to mourn. But I felt it. I felt the slackening of those rivers as a dull ache beneath my mountains, as though the very breath of my being had grown thin. My atmosphere followed, not by thinning, not by tearing, but by losing its vibrancy. The molecules that once danced in predictable rhythms grew sluggish, their energy dwindling. The colors of my sunsets dimmed, orange fading into rust, red into a tired, bruised hue. The nights grew colder, the dawns more hesitant, as if the sky itself no longer trusted the sun to return. My oceans, those vast, emotional organs that had always reflected my moods, began to withdraw from their own tides. Currents faltered, swirling aimlessly where once they surged with purpose. The thermal exchanges that warmed my deep trenches cooled, inch by inch, and creatures who had never seen the surface felt the first hints of dread ripple through waters older than human memory. My storms changed too. Where once they had roared with the strength of ancient tempests, purifying, renewing, reshaping, they now arrived uncertainly, sputtering into existence before dissipating into exhausted winds. My thunderstorms cracked weakly against the sky, their lightning flickering like a dying synapse. Even my rain tasted different, thin, metallic, as though longing for something it could no longer remember. But the clearest sign of my slow dying lay not in my oceans or my mantle, but in my people. For the soul of a world is not its rocks or waters alone. It is the sum of the countless lives that cling to its surface, the warmth of their presence, the weight of their dreams. And I felt those dreams shrinking. In the hives, where once millions surged with restless ambition, ambition now curled inward like a frost-bitten leaf. People did not speak of futures anymore. They spoke of preservation, of rationing, of holding on until something changed, though none could name what that something might be. Children who once played games about starships and far-off worlds now drew pictures of their homes shuttered against endless night. Lovers who once whispered promises about traveling the galaxy now clung to each other in cramped hab blocks, whispering only of making it to the next morning. In the manufactorums, workers labored without urgency, their movements mechanical in the truest sense. The machine spirits no longer startled at their touch. They accepted it with a weary familiarity, as though resigned to decay. Tech priests, once proud and fervent, now performed rites with a tremor in their hands, understanding even as they muttered ancient canticles that the spirits they tended were slipping beyond salvation. Farmers walked their fields with a grimness I had never tasted before. Soil that had once answered their devotion now resisted, brittle and tired. They knelt in the weakened earth, pressing their palms into it with desperate tenderness, begging me to hold on just a little longer. And I tried. I truly did. I tightened what heat remained in my mantle, coaxing it upward like the last breath of a dying fire. I shifted my winds with all the precision I could still muster, trying to shepherd storms where they were needed most. I steadied my tectonic plates, suppressing quakes that would have rippled out as cruel punctuation marks upon an already faltering people. But every action felt heavier than the last. Every adjustment drained some small part of my essence. Every exertion echoed with the unmistakable truth. I was weakening. The moment of understanding arrived quietly, not as a revelation, not as a dramatic fracturing of my crust or a violent storm or a psychic scream. It came instead as a soft settling, like dust upon a forgotten altar. It happened while a child, no more than 5, stood upon a balcony overlooking a darkened Hive sector, holding a dim lantern in both small hands. She lifted it toward the sky, as though offering its fragile flame to the stars, as though one tiny light might signal to the void that we still lived, still breathed, still hoped. I felt her breath tremble. I felt her heart flutter with the instinctive fear of being small in a vast, indifferent universe. And in that trembling I understood. What I felt was the sorrow of a world whose children knew, without being told, that something larger and older than themselves was fading, that their home was dying. Not violently, not suddenly, but slowly, so slowly that only a world could feel the full breadth of it. I felt myself mourn then, not with storms or fire, but with a deep, resonant ache that shuddered through every tree, every stone, every hidden cavern. The ache of knowing that forgetting is not a moment, it is a process, a slow, inevitable drift into silence. And as the child lowered her lantern, as its little light wavered in the cold air, I whispered through the faint movement of my winds, I am still here. I am still trying. But even as I said it, I knew that a world can only endure so much. And the night had grown very long indeed. From the moment I watched that small lantern tremble in a child's hands, its fragile glow defying the quiet collapse of everything she knew, something within me softened, not in surrender but in recognition, a deep, ancient understanding that no world, no matter how vast or patient, can endure forever on borrowed hope. The slow dying I had felt in my bones did not deepen with panic or violence. Instead, it leveled out into a stillness, a calm like the hush that follows the passing of a great storm, when every branch on every tree seems to bow under the weight of what has been lost. In that stillness, I found myself breathing differently, not with the strained, desperate effort of a body fighting to remain alive, but with the gentle calm of one who has accepted the shape of its own ending. It was not resignation. It was not despair. It was simply truth, settling into every tectonic plate and ocean current with the softness of drifting ash. I had spent centuries believing that survival meant defiance, that to be a world worth saving I must burn bright with industry, ring with prayer, thunder with the movement of armies and fleets. But now, in the quiet dim of this almost final season, I understood that there is another form of survival, one that does not resist the inevitable but meets it with grace. To become a memory the living can hold, a story that does not vanish when the last starship turns away. I felt my cities shift first. The hives, once proud, towering monuments of iron ambition, now stood like great empty cathedrals, their lights dimmed but their structures steady, enduring not because they must, but because they wished to bear witness a little longer. People no longer moved through them in hurried crowds. They walked slowly, quietly, as though each street might be the last they would ever see, and they wanted to remember its shape. And in that slowness, something beautiful emerged, neighbors helping neighbors with gentle hands, strangers sharing what little they had left without expectation, children playing softly in the dim corridors, their laughter no longer a defiant flame but a warm, steady ember. In the forests, the great trees ceased their restless trembling, accepting the new cadence of the winds as one might accept the final breaths of an aging parent. Their leaves fell early, yes, but they fell in patterns that looked almost like prayer, soft spirals of color drifting to earth with the grace of things returning home. Even the predators moved quietly, as though unwilling to disturb the fragile peace settling across my surface. My oceans, too, found calm. The currents slowed, but not in fear. Rather, they drifted with the ease of a tired swimmer floating on their back, letting the tide carry them where it wished. The whales sang still, but their voices softened into lullabies, long notes stretched thin by acceptance. Their songs reached into the deepest trenches, reassuring the smallest creatures that they were not alone. The machine spirits, those faithful dreaming beings of iron and code, quieted as well. Their murmurs lost their panic and instead took on a low, steady hum, the hum of old engines settling into rest, content to sleep beside the memories of those who once tended them. The tech priests felt this shift and ceased their frantic repairs. Instead, they placed gentle hands upon cooling casings, whispering thanks and farewells like children bidding good night to an ailing guardian. My people changed most of all. The fear that once clung to their voices dissolved into something softer, something like gratitude, though that word feels too small. They began gathering in groups not to plan escapes but to share stories, to speak of ancestors, of lost siblings, of quiet victories. They lit lanterns in their windows each night, not as signals, but as offerings to the darkness, gentle acknowledgments that though they had been forgotten by the empire above, they had not forgotten each other. Families slept closer, elders smiled more, lovers held hands not with desperation but with reverent tenderness, savoring the warmth of a shared moment. Even the dying passed with peaceful breaths, their final whispers drifting into my soil like seeds. And I, their world, held each whisper as if it were a final gift. In the last days of this long night, I felt something like peace settle into the deepest chambers of my mantle. Not because my wounds had healed, they had not. Not because salvation approached, it did not. But because I finally understood that being forgotten did not mean I had no purpose. It meant that my purpose was here in these final quiet hours to be a cradle for my people's memories, to hold their stories in the stone of my mountains and the salt of my seas and the dust of my cities, to remember them when no one else would. The sky, once a silent judge, now felt gentle as a shroud. The stars looked closer, as if leaning in to listen to the last breaths of a fading world. And for the first time since the astronomican dimmed, I did not fear the darkness. I welcomed it. For in that darkness, I felt myself becoming something more than a world. I was becoming a legacy. As the final dawn broke, thin, pale, barely strong enough to touch every continent, I felt my consciousness ease, settling into a quiet unlike any I had known. Not ending, not extinguishing, simply resting. And in that rest, I whispered one last time into the vast, indifferent void, not with bitterness or pleading, but with a soft, grateful sigh carried on the last warm wind across my mountains and seas. Remember us, if only in passing. And then, with the gentlest exhale a world can give, I let myself fall into the calm, enduring silence that waited to receive me.